let's just talk about that for a minute. Here are some facts you kind of need to know. So that will help you be able to work some of 8.4. We've talked about this a little bit. But if you have, just start out easy. If I say I have the square root of 5 times the square root of 5. Another way that we can write that is the square root of 5 squared. Are y'all okay with that? The calculator will do that for you. But just keep in mind the math behind this, because 5 times 5 is 25. And so the square root of 25 is just 5. So this answer is just 5. So whatever is, if you're squaring something, it's exactly the same underneath the square root, you're just going to end up getting that number. So for instance, if I wrote down the square root of 7 times the square root of 7, then you should be able to go immediately and just tell me that the answer is 7, because those are exactly the same under the square root. Is everybody okay with that? Like I said, your calculator, I mean, this part you don't have to memorize, because your calculator can do the square root of 7 times the square root of 7. But if you know that little trick, it's going to make your life easier here in a little bit. Okay. Another thing that you need to know is about imaginary numbers. And we have talked about this a little bit. We talked about the fact that I is equal to the square root of -1. Well, in this section, it's going to be important that you know that I squared, what I squared is. And I squared, if I is the square root of -1, then I squared is the square root of -1 times the square root of -1, which is very similar to what we talked about over here, right? If the numbers are the same underneath here, if it's the square root of 5 times the square root of 5, it's just 5. So the square root of -1 times the square root of -1 is what? -1. Okay. So it's going to be important that you can pull from this that I squared is -1. You need to know that I is the square root of -1, and you need to know that I squared is -1. Okay. So some of your support problems, I'm not going to work all of them, but looking back over some of the support that we had. For 8.4, I'm sorry. One of the things they wanted you to do, so I'm just going to write problem number 1. They wanted you to be able to do something like 3i times 3 minus 9i. They want you to be able to multiply that out. Okay, so you're going to do the distributive property and take that 3i in the front and multiply it by both the terms in the back. So 3i times 3 ends up being 9i. And 3i times -9i. So I'm just going to write this out separate. So minus, just so that I'm explaining that. So that would be 9i. And then minus 3 times 9 would give me 27. And then I times I is going to give me I squared. Okay, here's the part that's going to be a little bit tricky, because I squared is what? -1. You got to remember that. So this is really 9i minus 27 times -1, because I squared is equal to -1. So 9i plus 27. -27 times -1 is going to be, I can't raise that any higher, I'm sorry. That's going to be your answer to that. So if we make it a little bit more complicated, let's say we have 7 plus 4i times 8 minus 2i. Okay, we're going to multiply that 7 times the 8. We're using FOIL, right? First, outer, inner, last. So we've got 56. And then 7 times -2i is going to be -14i. Going to move to the 4i. 4i times 8 is going to be +32i. And then we've got to do 4i times negative 2i, which is going to be negative 8i squared. Is everybody okay with that? 4 times negative 2 gave me the negative 8, and I times I gave me I squared. Okay, so when I reduce this, I've got 56, the negative 14 and the negative 14i and the positive 32i can go together. And those two can combine to give me, I think it's positive 18i, negative 14 plus 32. And then this part right here. So this part means negative 8 times, what's I squared? Negative 1. So negative 8 times negative 1 is going to end up giving me a positive 8. So am I done? Because I can put the 56 and the 8 together and get 64 plus 18i. Okay. So this is not on support, but I do want to talk about it for just a minute. Anybody need more time on this? Okay. So if I had one that was like x minus 3 square root of 5, and then x plus 3 square root of 5, right, you should be able to tackle something like that. So what we would do, say this is number 3. We're still doing FOIL. So we've got x squared. And then we've got x times 3 square root of 5 would be plus. Usually you would write the x after the 3. So I did x times 3 square root of 5, and I got 3x square root of 5. I'm going to move to this middle term. Negative 3 square root of 5 times x is going to be negative 3x square root of 5. All right, then this last term is what gives people fits. So we're saying, we know it's a negative times a positive, so it's going to end up being negative. 3 square root of 5 times 3 square root of 5. Okay. These two terms cancel out because they're exactly the same, and one's positive and one's negative, so they just turn into 0. So what happens with this other stuff over here? You're gonna put the 3 times the 3, the numbers in the front, together, and the square root of 5 times the square root of 5. Now, I can't say this loud enough. If you type this in your calculator, 3 square root of 5 times 3 square root of 5, it's going to tell you the answer. But I want you to know where we're getting it from. So 3 times 3 is 9, and the square root of 5 times the square root of 5 is what? 5. Right? Square root of 5 times the square root of 5. We got that on that other page we were talking about, because the square root of 5 times square root of 5 is the square root of 25, which is 5. So then our final answer would be x squared minus 9 times 5, which is 45. When we reduce all that down. Another thing that you guys are going to have to do. So one more support problem. Another thing that you guys are going to have to do is multiply something that, like a binomial that has 2 terms, by a trinomial that has 3 terms. Going to have to be able to do that, and we can't use FOIL to do that. I know we've talked about this before, but this is going to be important when we get to this next section. So when we start doing this, it's the exact same thing as FOIL, though. You're going to take this W, and that W has to get multiplied by everything on this side. And you're going to do the same thing with the D. That D is going to have to be multiplied by everything on this side. That's making me think about Christmas. Red and green. Speaking of that, did y'all hear like on the news that you better buy your Christmas presents early because of the supply chain stuff? I don't know if that's true or not. Who knows? I'm worried about it for the little ones anyway. You better show up with what they want, right? Okay. So W times W, that's going to get you, W times W squared, I'm sorry, is W to the third. W times a negative WD is going to be negative. I'm sorry. Were you telling me the answer? Okay. W times D squared is going to be positive WD squared. Then I'm moving into my green arrows here and multiplying everything by D. So D times W squared, DW squared. D times negative WD is going to be negative WD squared. And then the last D times D squared is going to be a positive D cubed. In 8.4, you're going to have to know how to do this without doing first, outer, inner, last in your head. You're going to have to know I have to multiply everything in this by everything in this. Okay. Is there any of this stuff that's going to go together? So we've got W to the third, D to the third. Took care of those two. I've got a positive WD squared and a negative WD squared, so those would go away. I've got DW squared so these two are the same, or one's positive and one's negative, so those would go away. So these are the only things we have left. So the final answer would be W to the third plus D to the third. I'm sorry. We're good?
Yeah.
Okay, that's okay. No, I apologize. I sometimes have trouble hearing. Okay. So those are going to be the main things that you're going to need to do on the next section, is going to be able to multiply these things. Let me looking through the support real quick. They do have some problems in the support that are like factor 6y, not W, sorry. 6y squared plus 3y. Well, I feel like we've talked about this a lot, but if I want to factor that, I'm going to look for the common terms in these, and I'm going to say, okay, what's in 6 that's also in 3? Well, there's a 3 in both of those, so I could pull out a 3. And I'd look at my y squared and my y, the smallest amount of y's I have in either group would just be a y to the first, so I can at least take a y out of both of those. So then you have to think, well, 3y times what will get me back my 6y squared? Well, 3 times, you got to have times 2 to get back 6. And then y times y will get you back y squared. So then I've got to go, well, 3y times what would get me back 3y? Well, that's just going to be a 1. So that would be factored. You got to pull out the biggest things in both groups that you can take out. And then what you're left with is what you're going to factor. So you guys might need to see one more. Let's see. So if I have s to the 4th plus 4s cubed, and they're telling me to factor, well, this is a 1 and this is a 4. So I can't pull out any numbers from that because there's nothing that 1 and 4 have in common besides 1. So then I'm going to look at my variable. The smallest amount of s's I have in either group is s to the 3rd. So I can pull out an s to the 3rd. If I take an s to the 3rd out of s to the 4th, that's just going to be s to the 1st. If I take an s to the 3rd out of 4s to the 3rd, that's going to be plus 4. And you need to make sure that when you multiply it back out, you get what you started with. But that's factored. Okay. What if they say factor this? V squared plus 11v plus 30. What if I said solve it? What would you do? If I said solve it, the majority of you are going to go to your calculator and you're going to do the quad thing, and you would come up with the answers. You would say A is 1, B is 11, C is 30, right? You would be able to come up with the answers that way. So if you did that, and I'm just giving you a clue of this is kind of how you can cheat on this problem. But it would be, the calculator is going to tell you -5 and -6 as the answers. So how do you go from the answers to this? We've talked about this several times. These are the zeros. You do the opposite, so it would be v plus 6, or v, it doesn't matter what order, v plus 5, v plus 6, that's factored. You take it and go to the opposite. So what if you find out your zeros, you went to your calculator, you typed in some function and it told you, oh, your x's are 3/2 and 2. This one's kind of tricky, right? So the factored form would be x minus 2 for this part. Remember what you do when it's a fraction? You put the denominator in the front with the x, and then the numerator comes to the back and it's opposite of whatever it was. So if it was a +3, it would be a -3. Okay. So that should help you all with everything that's on 8.4 support, or yeah. And actually that was some of 5.1 support too. So I think we're good. Okay. So let me